Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A that we started to do. So these are just basically a compilations of questions that I get all week, and I kind of pick out a couple or a handful or four or five to try to answer live video. Most of these are coming through social media outlets. Some of them are coming through emails. But because of the nature of social media, like I can't really give a good in-depth explanation on there. I can give an in-depth explanation on a video or a podcast, but not as much whenever it's on whenever it's in like a short reel or something. So people always like the in-depth piece of it, but they like listening, they don't like reading. And so we started doing this, and we'll see what the evolution of this looks like. And if people continue to enjoy them and watch them, then we'll keep putting them together. And we've even kind of toyed with the idea of doing like a once a month or an every other week live Q&A for anybody that wants to attend, completely free of charge. You jump in at a certain time that we would set up. You ask any questions that you've got related to nutrition. I'll help answer them, help walk you through it, try to give you some good solutions. We would then obviously publish that so it can help other people too, and kind of like our own little live radio Q&A. So this will be obviously live on YouTube, which is where you're watching it now. We may even start posting them on podcasts as just kind of in between episodes, between our normally scheduled stuff, just again to try to get people the best content that we can that's actually helpful to them. It's actually based off of what we've seen in the, hundreds of or thousands of people that we've worked with over the years. And really, again, just trying to equip you with everything that you need. So we got a few questions coming in today, and we will answer those. If you are interested in something like a live Q&A regular basis, every other week, every month or whatever, if you'd be interested in that, you can email me directly or you can put it in the comments below. You can do, whatever's the easiest for you to kind of say, hey, yeah, I think that'd be cool and something I'd be interested in. And if so, if there's enough people that are interested, I'd be happy to set that up. So question number one, this is one that came in recently, should I eat less on rest days? Now, one of the ways that I'm always trying to frame my answers to these questions is obviously number one, you're looking at the question. Number two, I like to try to provide some background so people have an understanding as to, well, where did this even come from versus me just saying, oh, yeah, you should definitely eat more on rest days. I think it's worth knowing the background that comes and then giving you an answer that hopefully equips you to make your own decision. In other words, I'm not trying to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. It's like, look, here's the science, here's the data, here's what we know, here's what we've observed working with people. And then you make the call that you feel like is best for you based on what your goals are. So should you eat less on rest days? The answer to that is no, and definitely not if your main goal is improved performance. Remember that we engineer everything in Valley to Peak off of a triangle. And in those different triangles are different focus points, whether that's weight loss on one end of the triangle, whether that's performance on one end of the triangle, be that endurance, putting on muscle, what have you. And then you've got the third angle, which covers really just maintenance, retention of what you already are doing, whatever. There's not any real specific goal. You're just trying not to go backwards, but not necessarily making a hard push towards anything either. The main reason that you don't want to eat less on rest days is because rest days are an opportune time for you to repair the muscle that has been worn out all week long, right? And this is really twofold. One, you've got the act of recovery in and of itself. You're giving the muscle a break. It is good to overwhelm the muscle. In fact, one of the key principles of training is progressive overload. You're always exposing it to something new, something more challenging, something more difficult. And it's that system of exposure to something new and difficult, adaptation, exposure to something new and difficult, adaptation that allows you to improve. But rest days are an opportune time to allow that muscle to repair, recover, and improve from the challenge that it's been exposed to leading up to that date. Now, part two of that is it's also, because it's not working on that day, it is also an opportune time to now fill that muscle up with protein and fill that muscle up with carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is the main fuel of that muscle. So when you go and you engage in training again at the next session, it is completely bathed, it is completely saturated in fuel to go execute at your highest level. Because remember, if you're training and you're kind of going at 40%, 30% of what the target is, you're not really meeting your maximum potential. Even if your training is zone two, which is low intensity, you want to be at 100% of whatever your zone two is. If you are only kind of half-hearted in it, either because you're tired because you haven't had any rest days or just mentally you're fatigued, whatever, you're never going to reach your maximum potential. And that's the entire goal of investing the time to go train. So we have a visual image that we use in our education classes with people, and it looks like this. And you can just kind of see how the system works. You have the training itself, and then you take a recovery day. If you're not eating enough on these recovery day, the body never has the ability to repair and recover to its maximum potential, right? So if you're not eating, you're not getting the benefit of complete recovery and repair and allowing that muscle to be saturated and bathed in protein for recovery and carbohydrates for fueling at the next round. The second piece is that if you do take those days and you do allow for repair, the muscle will grow, your performance will improve. And it's this entire system that allows you to get better at performance. I don't know if anyone's ever said this before, but nutrition in and of itself is not going to improve your performance. It will not. And training without good nutrition will not improve your performance. It is those two hand in hand when they are together that allows you to improve it. So the training, if it's designed and it's written well, will be written in a way that allows you to progressively get more and more challenged. Progressively more and more challenged, the body has to adapt and you get better. If you are eating in a way that covers your needs based on that training schedule, you will get better. If you're not, you won't. If you have great nutrition, but your training plan sucks, or it's not written very well, or it's not progressively overloaded, it's not specific, it doesn't have all those fundamentals of training involved in it, you will, if you're brand new, you'll still go up because it's better than sitting on a couch. But you will reach a point where it's like getting better. That's it. You're peaked. It's done. You have to have both a good, well-written training program that includes periods of rest or recovery and a good nutrition program. Rest days and recovery days does not necessarily mean you're sitting on a couch. Rest days and recovery days could simply include something lower intensity, something with less volume, something that you just enjoy and isn't necessarily a part of your training program, right? It does not mean that you've got to lay on the couch all day long. Frankly, that could make it worse and cause your legs to feel really heavy. So, you can do what's called quote unquote active recovery where you're still moving, although maybe it's not at the intensity or the duration that you're normally doing whenever you're in a normal training program. So I think that that's an important piece to cover. You do not want to eat less on rest days. Even if you are in a fat loss phase of your program where you're trying to lose weight, we gear this up for people by writing them a 3-step process. Even if that's the goal, part of that 3-step process is the same intake on rest days as in on training days. So yeah, you may expedite your speed to the weight loss, but you will not feel good, you will not recover good, and that is one of the fastest ways to get someone to quit their plan, quit their nutrition program, because they feel like they've never got enough energy to go do things that they love. You can have both, but it does take some finesse and some planning. All right, number 2, can caffeine contribute to a higher than desired heart rate during endurance activities? The answer to that is yes. To date, I'm not saying this to applaud myself. I don't even know that it's really applaud worthy. Maybe I shouldn't say this publicly, but to date, I'm the only dietitian that I know of who suggests not having caffeine from an endurance standpoint. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, not everyone, but if someone we are working with is working towards an objective in the mountains or a goal in the mountains, it's usually high altitude. It's usually at a higher altitude than they live at, right? That could be as low as 7,000, 8,000 feet. that could be as high as 8,000 meters, right? A big, big wall mountain in the Himalayas, right? So it doesn't matter which end of the spectrum that you live on. If the body is not adjusted to the higher altitude, it's going to have to work harder to offset the lack of oxygen that you're there. It's a component that makes you work harder, makes your heart rate work harder. Number two, most people, if they have some sort of a goal, it's active, it's physical. They're not riding a ski lift from sea level to 8,000 feet or 8,000 meters. They're using their legs or some modality that involves them working to get to wherever it is that they're going. That's an added component. It's physical. It makes the heart work harder. So now we have two strikes against the heart, making it work harder than it typically does at rest. It doesn't make much sense to me to go introducing a third component of caffeine that we know at high doses in the recommended amount to increase performance. It doesn't make much sense to me to go introduce that on top of something that's already working harder, especially since we know that the heart is, the body's an amazing and capable machine, but the heart is very, very finicky. In other words, it doesn't need a lot of introduction to go awry, and it doesn't make much sense to me to introduce that. Now, this is a key piece of that, especially when you read the research and you read the data about why these recommendations for caffeine supplementation are there. A lot of it's cognitive. A lot of it is so that as you get tired, you still stay with it. You get a dose of carbs, you get a dose of caffeine, you get a little fuel. That does work. But you also get a dose of caffeine that's like, oh yeah, my brain's alert. To me, the time and the money would be better invested in working with a mindset coach, a performance coach, talking with a friend, working with a coach. Doesn't even necessarily have to be an expense added to your budget, but it would be better to go work on where am I going to go? What's my go-to whenever I'm in the cave, right? When the negative self-talk hits, whenever I want to quit, whenever it starts to get hard, whenever I go to that place where I'm like, oh, this sucks, I'm out. What's a place that I can go to in my head that reminds me, no, you're not out. You keep going. You figure that part of it out. You may be able to make the argument that an added high dose supplementation of caffeine is worth the tax of the heart if you saw this crazy improvement in physical performance. But we don't. We don't see that. The amount of improvement that we see is so small that to me it doesn't outweigh the reward does not outweigh the risk for me to recommend that people go and take it. Yeah, I mean, I guess, so to answer the question, can caffeine contribute to higher than desired heart rate during endurance events? Yes, it can, which is why I don't recommend it. And all of those reasons are exactly why. So you can do it. And it seems like nowadays, most companies are offering products where they offer both. They offer, and it's usually in the form of the combination of carbohydrate and caffeine at the exact same time. And you can buy either. You can buy one with caffeine, you can buy without it. Carbohydrates during exercise are fuel. That is effective. I would buy that if you want to. I wouldn't get the ones with caffeine. Now, someone on here is maybe at a more advanced level of their own personal research and would say, well, there's also some data that says when you take caffeine with carbohydrate, that it synthesizes or puts together greater glycogen stores, greater fuel stores. What about that? Again, to me, the reward does not outweigh the risk. If you have a good nutrition plan, if you have a good training plan, if you have trained, if you have fueled well leading not only up to, but in the hours before this event and during the event, if you're educated on how to execute your plan on the mountain or in the race or whatever, if all of those things are happening, there isn't a supplement on the planet that can touch you. And in my opinion, you would be better off, a person would be better served to figure that out than to just go buying some product that could potentially help synthesize another couple grams of carbohydrate deep in a race or a climb or whatever than another. But that is just my 2 cents. You can take that for what it's worth and the amount that you paid for it. So next question is, can I go lower carb on days where I train in zone 2? So background. Zone 2 training is a small fraction of your maximum heart rate. So if you were to go outside and do an all-out sprint, your kid was running to the road, you wanted to catch them before they got there, and you were 100 yards away, they couldn't hear you yelling, you went all-out max sprint. We could, in theory, and I'm simplifying this, call that your maximum heart rate. So you got to your kid, we tested your heart rate, and your heart rate was at, call it 200. That's your max. Now, the zone theory basically then splits that into usually 5 different categories, and those categories are broken down by a percentage of that max. Zone 5 would be the closest to the max. Zone 4 would be really challenging, but not all the way to the max. Zone 3 would be similar. You could hold the pace a little bit longer, but you're not exactly comfortable doing it. And then zone 1 would be like you're casually walking down the road with your spouse. Zone 2 kind of fits right there in the middle, obviously, because of the naming. Between zone 1, casual walk with your spouse, and zone 3, this is uncomfortable, but I can hold this for a little bit, not too bad. The idea of zone 2 is I could essentially do this forever. The only thing that I'm really limited by is fuel and time. So it's a pace that's not so fast that you feel like you're going to burn out, but it's also not necessarily a casual walk. So with that established, back to the question. And the question says, can I go lower carbohydrate intake on days where I'm training more zone 2? The answer to that is you could, yes, because remember, intensity of the activity is going to depend on what fuel source is used. The greater the intensity, the more the body relies on carbohydrate. The lower the intensity, the more the body is relying on a mix of carbohydrates and fats. And so when you shift over to about 80 to 85% of all-out sprint, it's 100% carbohydrate. But as things go down from there, it's less and less on carbohydrate and more a mix. It still is using carbs, but it's more of a mix of dietary fat and carbohydrate. So could you get by going lower carb in zone 2 days? You could. Do you have to? Not necessarily. Is there any benefit to it? Not necessarily. Unless you're trying to really restrict calories and lose some weight. You could get by doing less fueling during the activity because the intensity is lower. We generally recommend 1 gram of carbohydrate for every 1 minute of high intensity exercise, or kind of 80% high intensity exercise. So if you're going really, really low on that day, you may need way less than that. You could potentially reduce some carbs from that. You could also risk some performance advantage by doing that. So there's a lot of potential avenues that you could explore, right? There's a lot of potential for different answers to this depending on the scenario, which is why the best answer in nutrition is it depends, because it always depends on the person, it always depends on the scenario, and everything is relative. But to answer general 30-foot overview, could you get by with going lower carb on days that you're training zone 2? The very, very, very general 30-foot answer is you could. More so than if you had a tempo day or a day where the intensity was a little bit higher. Next, how do I deal with exhaustion on long, hard, high altitude days? Ideally, I don't want to get to the point of exhaustion, and I would rather prevent it. What suggestions do you have? There's a couple of suggestions I would have. Number one, make sure you know your fueling plan when you're engaged in the activity, and have a plan. Let it be written, put it on an app on your phone, or put it in a laminated, write it on a note card and then laminate or put packing tape over that so if it gets wet, it doesn't smear. Have some kind of fueling plan, though, that you can default to and make sure that you stay on top of that. I have way too many stories of people who have failed to execute their plan and have to come off the mountain early. And this generally happens when people are trying to summit, one of the big summits. Most often, it seems like the summit that most people chase most often is Kilimanjaro. And that seems to be the place that this pops up the most. You have people who execute that plan really well, and all the other variables, of course, are good too, weather window, all of that. If that's the case, things tend to go well. If that's not the case and they fall behind because of the magnitude of something like that, it's hard to ever catch up. So you want to be sure that you're staying on top of your fuel plan. That's number one. The next couple are going to just be through an answer as from my own personal experience, as well as in working with people. Number one, and this has nothing to do with nutrition, is you have to be aware enough to remind yourself that that exhaustion and that fatigue is as much a head issue as it is a body or physicality issue. If you're fueling well, the only thing that you're limited on in terms of getting to where you want to go in distance is time. Fuel and time are the two greatest barriers to you reaching wherever you want to go if all other factors are lined up. What tends to happen though is we hit a place of fatigue and exhaustion, our mind is tired, and we just want out of the situation. And if you can get, this goes back to the comments on the caffeine too, if you can get someone to have a mantra that they recite to themselves in that moment and remind yourself that it's as much in your head as it is your physically. Your body's gonna, your head's gonna, your mind's gonna quit. I mean, this is true of me. My mind wants to quit way before my body does. That's true for a lot of us. And if you can have the presence of mind in the moment to remind yourself of that, you're far more likely to just continue to press on, which is part two. This is the second part of that and this extension of that. Remind yourself you won't always feel like that. The way that you feel in that moment will not stay around forever. It will either A, improve as you keep going and you keep marching on, you get over that block, you get over that hump, and then all of a sudden it's the fog sort of lifts and you're back in it, right? That's happened a lot to people. Number two, at some point, whether it's at the end of that day or the end of the next day or whatever, at some point that feeling you have will stop. At some point you will come back down or off that mountain. At some point you will be back in a sleeping bag. At some point you will be back at home or on an airplane back home. At some point you will be off of there. If you can remind yourself of that, it's a lot easier to engage in part one and saying, look, I am tired, but this is as much in my mind as anything else. And I know that at some point this is going to eventually stop. So I'm going to keep pressing on until I find what that point is. Right. And so I think that those two things are really important. And then the third one, and I guess really all three of these go hand in hand. As a part of writing on your fueling plan, writing a mantra on this card that you laminate or whatever, I would say when it shows up, invite it. Right. So if you start feeling like you want to quit and you're feeling fatigued, invite it. Say, I knew you'd show up. I didn't think it'd be this long, but I knew you'd show up. Here you are. Right. What tends to happen, and this is from recounts of people who have tried to summit, didn't summit, as they were telling the story back. I've seen this in hikes I've been on. I've experienced this, right? What ends up happening is that feeling shows up and your mind says, oh no, this is the worst thing that could have happened. This is exactly what I was worried about. And from there, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's like you start to think about, I start to think about, we all start to think about the worst case scenario showing up. Here it is. I knew it would happen. I just need to get off of here. I knew I shouldn't have done this. I knew I didn't train hard enough. I knew I didn't have a good enough nutrition plan. I knew I didn't, whatever, right? If you can just not let that happen, you will put yourself in a better position to do number one and number two that we talked about earlier. So when it shows up, have a mantra, invite it in. Don't be shocked by it. It'll show, I promise. And when it does, that conversation with yourself needs to be, hey, I knew you would come. I didn't know it would be this late in the game, but here you are. So I won't feel like this forever. I'm going to keep pressing on. My mind is strong. My body's feeling tired, but it's not done. It's a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. Nobody said I need to set a land speed record. So I'm just going to casually stay in my own zone and continue to march my way up to where it is that I need to go as far as to reach whatever my goal is. So there you have it. There are 5 questions from the last couple of weeks that have come in. We get a lot more than that. Sometimes they turn into podcasts, sometimes I just reply, but if you have them, please send them in. We'll do videos like this. And if anybody's interested, again, just let me know that you may be interested in doing like a regular live Q&A where we can answer questions that you may have and help set you up for success on whatever it is that you've got. So appreciate you guys watching. And yes, if you have any questions, my email is down here below and I would be glad to respond to those. We'll talk to you later.